Well, thank you everybody for coming today. My name is Daniel Fiverson, and I would like to talk about the Saturn-Uranus cycle today. And I'm going to approach it from three perspectives. We're going to look at the mythology, the archetypes behind it mythologically. We're going to look at some of the mundane effects that we have experienced and some of the events that have occurred in this current Saturn-Uranus cycle. And then we're going to look at an individual. And I have channeled Muhammad Ali to join us today. So he will be coming back to be our participant, our volunteer. So the mythology of it is quite dense, but I think it's quite interesting, and it yields some very interesting insights into the relationship between these two planets. This is a quote from Hesiod. The origins of the mythology really come from either Homer through the Iliad or through the Greek poet Hesiod. And here, from his theogony, which is actually the genealogy of the Greek gods, he says, at first chaos came to be, but next wide-bosomed earth, Gaia, and earth first bare starry heaven, Uranus, equal to herself, to cover her on every side and to be an ever-abiding place for the blessed gods. Afterwards she lay with heaven, was born Cronus, the wily youngest and most terrible of her children, and he hated his lusty sire. So what really is happening here is that Uranus, known originally as Uranus, was the first of the sky gods. The first god that came into the pantheon was the Earth. And Earth by herself, by most accounts, created Uranus. And he was the sky god, and he actually was literally the sky. And then the two of them together created the Titans, and from which Saturn was born. And the mythology here is quite interesting because between the two of them, Gaia and Saturn produced the 12 Titans, the most famous of which we know as Saturn or Kronos. But they also created three of the single-eyed giant monster Cyclops, and three of the 100-armed, see if I can pronounce this correctly, the Hecatonicers, who were described as 100-armed monsters as well. They were all giants. And Saturn hated these things that he had created. So he banished them. He sent them to the Tartarus, which is a dungeon-like place within the earth from which they could not escape. And Gaia was so upset with what he had done, banishing the offspring, that she persuaded her sons to rebel against Saturn. And this is a photo, an image. I can't read the artist because the names are covering it, but you see the attribution there. It's I believe 16th century painting, and it describes how the five sons, four of them, took up the four corners of the earth, waiting for Saturn to come back down to the earth, to come into the earth. And Kronos, or Saturn, waited in the center. And when Uranus descended, he castrated his father. And so, this is an interesting thing because first of all, it brings up a generational karma, if you would, because the Titans themselves, Zeus among them, then Zeus also, who became the primary god, also felt that he was going to realize the same fate as Uranus, and he began to eat his children as well. Saturn actually is depicted eating his children, but it was Zeus who was most famous for that. And as a side note, Uranus's castrated genitals were cast into the sea foam, and from them Aphrodite was born. So this is rich in symbolism of the rivalry between father and son that's carried on through generations, and the idea that Aphrodite herself was born from the sexuality of her father, which all of these certainly leave room for lots of discussion in the future. So most of us here, I'm sure, are already very familiar with Saturn. And these are some keywords that I borrowed from the glossary, the EA glossary that Linda has edited. Primarily what we're looking at with Saturn is that, this is conditioning by family and society. It's the layers of conditioning that we pick up, in our many, many lifetimes. We're like onions. We have many layers of conditioning. Some of it is what's the karmic trail dust of all of our lifetimes that came before, all the trials and tribulations and triumphs and tragedies that we've experienced. But then we come into the world and we have all the conditioning that we learned from our parents, from our friends, from our social group, from our religion, from our ethnicity, from our gender. Layers and layers and layers of conditioning that we bring in with us. And Saturn is correlated to all of that conditioning. It's about the conformity, and it represents authority. And primarily Saturn correlates to man-made law, and it's our social position. And we see Saturn as maturity and old age and responsibility in our Saturn returns as we are facing circumstances and events in our lives which bring this maturity and responsibility. Saturn is structure and form primarily. It gets a bad rap, but really what it is structure and form. And it's kind of like Cinderella's sisters trying to fit into her little slipper. When the form or the structure doesn't fit or is something new to us, it's difficult, it's painful, it becomes a challenge. So very often Saturn, is very challenging to us because it's asking us to fit into a form and a shape which is going to be very new to us and may feel very uncomfortable. It becomes our boundaries, it's ancestral, it's our tradition, and it shows up as our patriotism and our nationalism. On the psychological side, it's depression, repression, and oppression. It shows up as our fear and our guilt, our paralysis, it's our grief, self-defeat, it's futility, it's our judgment. This is, why Saturn has the bad rep that it has, because it does produce all these psychological states. But these states are not produced by Saturn. These states are produced by us in response to the circumstances and the structure that Saturn places before us. Uranus, has mythologically, was the one who ate his children, and he's kind of ogre-like, actually. But I follow Rick Tarnas's lead in the understanding of using the archetype of Prometheus rather to represent Uranus. He was also one of the Titans. He was one of the second generation Titans. And he was not anything like the paranoid and sadistic Cronus that I've described before. He was the Titan and god of forethought and of crafty counsel. He was given the task of molding mankind from clay. He was actually the agent of mankind. And he only was interested in bettering mankind's existence. And this brought him into direct conflict with Zeus. To better the lives of his creation. So first he tricked the gods out of the best portion of a sacrificial feast, acquiring meat for man. And then later we all know the famous story that he stole fire from the tip of Zeus's spear, and he gave fire to mankind. And if we put that into context of the time, fire was like we'll call it the World Wide Web, or whatever the cutting edge technology was at that time, was fire. So Uranus has come to be associated with those technologies, any cutting edge new technology, science, medicine, that comes into our world. As punishment for these rebellious acts, he ordered that Pandora would deliver misfortune to man. That Pandora's box of misfortunes became part of, oh, I hope that's not interfering, that became part of mankind's experience. And meantime, he was arrested and he was staked to a mountain in the Caucasus where an eagle fed on his liver, and in some stories it was his heart, that regenerated on a daily basis. And every day, the next day, the eagle would come back and eat his heart out again, which again is a very moving analogy, of some of the human experiences that we do go through. But generations later, Chiron, who was his friend, traded his life from Prometheus. And the Chiron story you all know, I won't repeat it. But Chiron wanted to give up his own life, and he traded it for his friend Prometheus. Chiron became the constellation Sagittarius, and Prometheus was freed by Heracles, who was also one of his friends. So it's a very moving juxtaposition between the two, but they were father and son. And I think that's an important thing to remember, that what we're looking at, when we see these two giants, though Saturn is much, much greater than Uranus, that what we're encountering is this, we go up against authority. The image, that I originally showed, that I used for my opening image, here's one man standing against this tremendous authority of the state. This is such a perfect analogy of Uranus and Saturn. There's no fear. There's no the individual is equal to the state, if not in size, but in bearing and in power. And I think that is also a prevalent theme that's running through our own time as well, and we'll get into that a little bit. So why did I choose this subject for today? Well, here's the chart of this very moment. Well, it's 20 minutes ago. But you can see that there is a trine here between Saturn and Uranus. We're at the point in their 45-year cycle where Saturn is forming a series of 3 exact trines to Uranus this year. And amidst all of the difficult squares and oppositions that we are going through, it stands out as the one clear light, if you would, in all of the difficulties that we're having, because it's showing us that we can be inspired, our hopes and ideals do have some meaning, and we can exercise that freedom and individuality that was given to us in spite of all the difficulties and all of the power and force and authority that seems to be lined up against us. And you can see that there's actually a grand cross today. Probably all of you are familiar with the T-square that has been going on since last year as Jupiter opposes Uranus and squares Pluto. As this Uranus-Pluto epic square separates, we have Jupiter coming in here this year, giving it one last pulse of energy, one last boost that really will propel it well into the future. And Vesta, who I personally believe bears a strong correlation to Uranus as well, is completing the empty arm of the T-square, creating this grand cross. Vesta is all about our authenticity and our bond to ourselves, and this is very much the archetype that is, the Promethean archetype that is expressed by Uranus. So the image that I showed you of Tiananmen Square actually occurred at the conjunction in 1988. It's why it's such a fitting image. It was a student-led demonstration in Beijing. It actually occurred in early 1989, and it was a popular national movement inspired by the protests during that period. And if we remember anything about history, the communist China is one of the most solid, impregnable forces, government forces on the planet. And so this uprising, if you would, this movement was very, very much unexpected, which is a totally Iranian aspect, and really was an amazing event to everyone who witnessed it. Obviously, the protests were forcibly repressed. The government declared martial law, and it became known as the Tiananmen Square Massacre at one of the uprisings, one of the demonstrations where hundreds, and they've suggested perhaps even thousands of the protesters were murdered. The other major thing that occurred at this time was perestroika. And perestroika was a political movement for the reformation of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union. And it was widely associated with Mikhail Gorbachev, who was probably in our history the most liberal or progressive of all of the prime ministers or premiers of Soviet Russia. But it did eventually lead to his retirement, and it brought in Vladimir Putin, and we're going to see that later in the cycle where Putin shows up on schedule. It also led to the end of the Cold War and to all the revolutions that broke out in 1989 in Eastern Europe. The other things that happened here, we only have to say Lockerbie, and everybody knows exactly what that meant. I had this here because it is associated not only with the disaster, but it is aviation. Boeing 747s actually came into existence around the same time, but it was significant that this did happen. And if we go back and look at the chart, we can see that there are some indications here. We have the moon and Ceres and Aries. Excuse me, wrong chart. I'm going to diminish that. Okay, there we go. You can see in this chart that there's also a partile grand square. It's all at 23 degrees. We have the nodes with Mars and Chiron squaring the nodes exactly. So this was the kinds of energy that that brought some of these events about. Oh, sorry. On a more of a scientific note, the Surgeon General announced for the first time that cigarette smoke was addictive. And NASA scientists testified that man-made global warming had begun. We had the internet, and then we had the first virus. The first computer worm was released into the wild. And we had the prototype B-2 stealth bomber revealed, all scientific advancements. The transatlantic telephone cable, first internet connection under the Atlantic as a result. And Tim Berners-Lee may not be a household word, but anybody who's studied any computer history will know that he was the man who realized and imagined the World Wide Web, which is where we are right now. So all of these things began at the Saturn-Uranus conjunction, and Uranus being science, and Saturn being new forms of things being created. So here we can see the evidence of that. And this is the chart again. It's interesting to see that this conjunction also began with this very strong stack up of planets in Sagittarius, Moon, Saturn as part of this conjunction, and Uranus, all in Sag. And the past 40 years of our life have really been about truth unfolding and discovering new truths, especially in the last 15 or 20 years. The truth in different versions has become something that we're all very aware of. So it is the blueprint. It's the footprint of the entire 45-year cycle as it unfolds. Elsewhere in this chart, we also see that we have Ceres and Mercury conjunct the Sun. So this Ceres clearly is climate change. And again, we have the three of them in Aquarius in Uranus' sign. So it restates this Saturn-Uranus conjunction very strongly. And even though they're not involved in this they are involved in the grand square. Excuse me, the Sun and Mercury are not. But this square also of the nodes and our evolutionary axis, our trail of crumbs behind us, evolutionarily in the world and individually, and the probable realities that stretch out before us, are all directly tied in to this event and to these energies of determining what is our authenticity, and who are we as individuals in the collective, and how are we expressing that? Do we have the courage to do it? How is our self-image associated with this? All of these things swirl around this entire cycle at this seed point. So the first square occurred 1999 to 2001. And we have the establishment of the euro, the establishment of the European community, which again, is a very Saturnian, Uranian, whole new form of the collective, a whole new form of money. Bill Clinton is acquitted of impeachment. I think that that's important because Bill, I think, was very, very much an individual as president. I think he was definitely a man of the higher mind, very Uranian. He used to read 3 books at once. He probably still does, unless they used to. But he's quite an intelligent being. And we in America are very adolescent about sexuality and sexual mores. And I'm not condoning necessarily what he's done, but there is. Culturally, as part of our conformity, there is a certain standard that everybody is supposed to, stand up to, and he didn't. Whatever his relationship was within his marriage and with Hillary, just because he's president of the United States, that doesn't make us his judge. And I think so. I think that this is why this Saturn square Uranus really comes up here, because this is individuality and conformity in this, and Dr. Kevorkian as well. And some of you may not be old enough to remember. I'm sure you all do. He was Dr. Death. He believed in euthanasia and being able to euthanize these people who were really needed to be put out of their misery. And it went on for many years, and he was finally convicted and found guilty. But again, this is an issue of, right and wrong. And, is it up to the individual to determine what's right and wrong in terms of certainly when they can die? Or does the state somehow, can dictate to us when we're born and when we die? Bill Gates became the wealthiest individual in the world, and interestingly enough, this event was just repeated. I just read that he is about to become the world's first trillionaire. This was a result of computers, of Microsoft Windows. It was sorry, just forgot what I was going to say. But he did put a computer on everybody's desk, and as a result, he has earned that wealth. We had the Columbine High School massacre, and it was the first of these really horrible shootings. And so I think it's the one that was really most horrific for us. John Kennedy Jr. His plane crashes again. Aviation is Uranus, Saturn. Squaring this, definitely is going to bring aviation issues. We already saw we had Lockerbie at the conjunction. The People's Republic of China launches their first spacecraft. So the Chinese enter the world platform of space travel, which again is a great scientific advancement. And here we have Putin becoming president of Russia. At the conjunction, we had perestroika, and here at the square we actually have perestroika in essence being, yes, there was a complete reformation of the Communist Party, but Vladimir Putin was not just president, he was on his way to become the next czar. From a scientific perspective, we had the Human Genome Project, which was a tremendous accomplishment. Here, the scientific advancement that actually created a blueprint, a map of the human genetics. And this was at the square. Squares are not always, squares are not bad. And we know that as EA astrologers, that sometimes squares will generate something that would not necessarily have happened at the trine. We had the International Space Station, and then we had the whole issue surrounding the election of Bush and Gore, with the Supreme Court having to step in, Saturn being the law, and Uranus being the collective, to actually decide what the presidency was going to be. And really what it did is it stopped the Florida presidential recount, which gave by default the presidency to George Bush. And this is the chart of those times with that, given those contexts. So here we see again a strong stellium in Taurus, squaring Uranus in its own sign. Excuse, I'm just checking my notes here. I want to make sure I'm not leaving anything out. So, I mean, this is about finance, authority, leadership, and we saw all those things come into play in the context of this chart. The squares, are certainly not easy. Wasn't easy on Bill Clinton for sure, or Dr. Kevorkian, but at any rate, this is what that chart looked like. And, it was about meaning and where really is there meaning in our lives? All this Taurus, second house energy. So in 2002, 2004, we had the first trine of the cycle. And here we experienced Enron, which was one of the greatest corporate examples of malfeasance in economic, American economic history. And then we also had the Homeland Security Act being enacted as a consequence of 9/11. The Hubble Space Telescope was launched. That's where these beautiful images have come from. We would not have them without it. And interestingly enough, Mars Odyssey mapped the surface of Mars. And if we look at the chart, we see that Uranus actually is conjunct Mars. The Space Telescope also, I think, relates to that conjunction, because here we have exploration, really ramped up with Mars and Uranus traveling through the sky together. Uranus was, both of them were actually squaring the nodes, which we know is a skip step. So, this could be related to Homeland Security. It could be related to Enron. It's hard to say, exactly what those skip steps were at the time. I'm a little, I can't tell you that I have a really strong answer as to what was happening there. If anybody has any comments afterwards, I would love to hear it. You can maybe post it in the EA Zoom meetings forum Facebook page. But here we have also a strong trine from Saturn and Sun back to the Uranus-Mars conjunction. And I think that this definitely deals with homeland security, because this was in the sign of Cancer. And it's in Pisces. And, homeland security still, again, this is a personal viewpoint, but it's questionable as far as I'm concerned. It comes from a nebulous area. It's nebulous law as far as I'm concerned. So we can see the Pisces influence of Uranus and Mars. So in 2008 to 2010, we had the opposition. And everybody remembers 2008. We had the market crash, the banking scandals. It was a very, very a difficult time economically. We also had the emergence of WikiLeaks. And we'll talk about that in a little bit of put that in perspective. WikiLeaks released 272,000, I believe, documents. Ed Snowden came along a few years later and released 1.7 million documents. And we'll see at the last trine here, I believe, that the Panama Papers released 11.5 million documents. That was 10 times what was released by Snowden. So this goes back to the comment I made about the strong Sagittarian influence that was seated at the conjunction of Saturn and Uranus in Sag. And not coincidentally, Saturn, was back in Sagittarius when a lot of these things happened. Then, we had Barack Obama being elected the first Black American president. And again, I think that this is a very strong juxtaposition of the individual versus the state, where a Black man became president. There are still many people throughout his 2 terms who never really accepted this. And we're seeing even today a lot of indications of where there is this distortion in our national psyche and our collective psyche about race and gender. So that in the opposition, this is what happened, and the Black American became president. We had an 8-1 in Samoa, a 7-6 in Sumatra, a 7-0 in Haiti, an 8-8 in Chile. We had a volcanic eruption in Iceland that actually disrupted air traffic for weeks. We had a 7-1 in New Zealand. We had another earthquake and tsunami in Sumatra. Okay, all this, and we'll see this in the chart. We had the Deepwater Horizon drilling platform explode in the Gulf of Mexico. On the positive side, we had some interesting science. We had Haumea classified as the 5th dwarf planet. A private company developed a space launch vehicle that was the first to successfully orbit the Earth, SpaceX. We had the Large Hadron Collider in Switzerland, which again is a great tool for physics. And a little bit past this opposition, we had Fukushima. Saturn was actually full phase to Uranus by this time, but I believe that it belongs in this grouping. And you can see in the chart what brought it on. We had this powerful T-square, not too much different than actually what we're having right now, though. Saturn is in this chart is in the place where Jupiter is today. But these powerful outer planets yielded this tremendous geophysical energy that just was released into the Earth. So it's not surprising that these events occurred. We also again have a stack up of planets in Uranus' sign in Aquarius. The Moon at the opposition was in Aquarius, and we had Neptune conjunct Chiron. So it was a very, very powerful time. There are actually 2 T-squares in this chart. No, 2 T-squares in this chart because we do have Uranus and Jupiter squaring the nodes again. So 15, if you allow a 15-degree orb. So you can see, what was responsible for a lot of what's happened here. I think of all the things that we're seeing besides the earth changes, which are certainly quite significant. I think that WikiLeaks and the stock market plunge are the two takeaways here that we need to watch going forward. So now, as I said before, we are in the midst of the second trine. And we had the Panama Papers published. The Juno spacecraft orbited Jupiter. We've had some spectacular images. I probably should have used the Jupiter image here from Juno. Solar Impulse becomes the first solar-powered aircraft to circumnavigate the Earth. So we've had some great science. It's still unfolding for us. Certainly, as we look at, this is a chart for the last of the three trines at the end of this year. But just turn on the news, or even just, maybe some of the things going on in your neighborhood or your own life are going to reflect a lot of what we're seeing. But what's important is that this trine gives us the option to remember that we are individuals, that we have a higher mind, that we can be inspired, that regardless of how great the impasse seems to be, we can self-empower ourselves to overcome it, because the intention can be greater than the fear of the event. There's really some beautiful energy in this chart for November. Besides the grand trine, which is quite obvious here, there's a very interesting quintile trine. Quintiles bring us a lot of creative inspiration. They really are what makes us individuals, what makes us different. A plumber can have a quintile just like an artist can. A plumber can find a whole new way to plumb, to run piping through a house or a building, just like an artist can find a whole new way to image something that he's perceived. So it's wide open in terms of our inspiration and in what we can actualize and what can truly happen. But clearly, with all the squares and oppositions that are happening and have happened, it's going to be an uphill struggle. So, Muhammad Ali, we know him as a heavyweight champion, activist, and philanthropist. And his chart is quite interesting. There are two major things going on that I see in the chart. One, there's this powerful opposition from the conjunction of Pluto and Chiron to the stellium, the Aquarius stellium in his sixth house, and his sun are all opposed. He's a 12th house Pluto, so he's a Pisces soul. And Pisces souls, have experienced all of the archetypes that have come before. It certainly doesn't mean that this is their last time around or anything like that. But it means that they have the ability and the compassion and the understanding of everybody else, because they've been there, they've experienced it, they know what it is to be an Aries and a Taurus and a Cancer and a Gemini and a Cancer, all the way around the wheel. They've been through all of it. And Ali came into the world, carrying a karmic burden, if you would. He was born a black man in the 1940s in Kentucky. It certainly was not an easy place to land, but it's where he chose to be. But he came equipped. His sun in Capricorn, in some ways it doesn't get better than that. Sun in Capricorn is going to get something done. They're not just going to roll over and say, well, I'm a black man in the 1940s in Kentucky, I'm just going to go off in the field and chew on some sugar cane. He at the age of 18, he was already learning how to box. And all this Aquarius energy, his Mercury and his moon, it really gave him the individuality and the need to move past. He was compelled, he was obsessed with his own individuality, and that seemingly isolated sun Capricorn really isn't isolated at all. It's what he needed to achieve something and to pull it all together and to become who he was, and not be lost in the shuffle. Especially with Saturn and Uranus up there in Taurus in his 10th house, both retrograde. We're going to come back to this chart a little later. So, as I said, when he was 18, he was learning how to box. And he already made a name for himself. And he was invited, he had the opportunity to go to Rome to the Olympics. And he wouldn't go because he was afraid of flying. Saturn conjunct Uranus, Uranus is flight. Retrograde in Taurus. Taurus doesn't even want to, go at the front door if they don't have to. But he was convinced that he needed to go, and he got on the plane, and he eventually he won 2 gold medals at the Rome Olympics, and he established himself on the world stage of boxing as who he was, and it was his first appearance. And this is the chart of that event, approximately around that time, and you can see that Uranus, by transit, had now entered his first house. So this definitely brought him into the spotlight. His individuality was visible for all to see. Who he was he had approached a public stage, and he also was having a nodal return. So this was karmic. This was something that his higher self had set up for him. This was his destiny. That at this point in his life, this would happen for him, but he had to have the courage to do it, and he found that courage within himself, and he succeeded. Saturn was squaring and sextiling his nodes as well, and this is where that Saturn in Capricorn, that Moon in Capricorn really paid off, because he was determined that he would do it. He had the wherewithal and the foundation within himself to be able to say, okay, this is what I need to do, and off he went. A few years later, Uranus and Pluto joined up in his first house, and this was the beginning, of the Uranus-Pluto cycle that we're now at the first quarter. And it was on his nodes, and it opposed Chiron was also opposing. And Jupiter was conjunct his Uranus and his Saturn, and Neptune had just entered his 4th house. So his need for spiritual self-expression was awakened by this Neptune. The nodal axis triggered these evolutionary events in his life that reflect his relationship between himself and others in the world at large. This was his spiritual awakening. He said, Cassius Clay is my slave name, and he didn't want it anymore. And he took the name Cassius Clay. First he called himself Cassius X, and he committed to his belief system, and he officially joined the Nation of Islam in 1964 under these transits. 3 years later, he was called up by selective service. And again, Neptune still transiting his 4th house, now conjunct Vesta, opposite Uranus and Saturn. He said, no, hell no, I won't go. Uranus and Pluto had entered his 2nd house. And so what had meaning and what was really important for him came to the forefront. It really wasn't what they told him he was supposed to do or what he needed to do, because it's obvious that he never really paid attention to that before. He did get on the plane though, but he wasn't compelled because it was the law. Saturn, Uranus, he was compelled by where the true meaning of his own self was, and he believed for his own spiritual belief system that fighting the war in Vietnam was wrong, and he wouldn't go. And as a result, he was stripped, he was convicted of a felony, and he was stripped of his world title and his boxing license, so he could no longer box. It was a huge blow for him. And you can see this in the aspects that are here. As Jupiter conjoined his Pluto, and Saturn sextiled Jupiter as well. So there was a limitation to his growth in terms of his career, and in terms of his personal ambitions, and how he even viewed himself. The good news is that the Supreme Court eventually overturned his conviction in 1971. In 1984, he was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. And Parkinson's disease is a disease of the brain. It's actually a disease of the enzymes of the brain, which are ruled by, guess what, Uranus. So, if we go back just for a moment to his natal chart, we can see that his Saturn-Uranus 10th house in Taurus is ruled by Venus. Venus is in Aquarius. Uranus and Venus are mutual reception. His Venus is retrograde, his Uranus is retrograde, and the square itself, it definitely can be a signature of a health issue regarding his Uranus. The disease was not brought about in most cases, genetically. It was brought about. It was a lifestyle disease, if you would, for him, because he took so much battering. He was so battered and beaten as a result of his career that he actually probably had some brain damage. And it's about dopamine and acetylcholine. In Parkinson's disease, the brain stops producing enough dopamine. It starts to produce too much acetylcholine, and it begins to affect your movement. And it's why it becomes such a degenerative, debilitating disease. But as a result, he created the Muhammad Ali Parkinson Center in Phoenix, began raising money, put a lot of his own money into it. And in the last years of his life, he not only was outspoken in terms of his own activism, but also in terms of his own philanthropy. And again, you can see how Chiron has now come up to his Uranus. Chiron definitely can be health issues. Saturn was opposing his Mars. So, here perhaps is the overlay of all that battering his Martian lifestyle, if you would. And Uranus is conjunct to South Node, so in Sag. So we see a number of indications of. I'm sure if somebody here is a better medical astrologer than I am, they'll probably see some other things in it. But it's pretty clear that the Uranus Saturn squaring Jupiter, squaring Venus as its ruler in Aquarius with the mutual reception is definitely going to hold some responsibility for it. So that's what I have for you folks today. I hope you enjoyed it, and thank you all so much for coming. I think we have a couple of minutes left, so if anybody wants to unmute, has any questions or comments or additions, or can add anything to it that they feel is relevant, please go ahead.
Hi, Daniel. This is Sarah West.
Hi.
I wanted to say thank you. You got me thinking about all these times during the cycle of Uranus and Saturn for my own life. And so it kind of prompts, kind of exploring that in my own experience. Because some of the dates, the years that popped up in your sharing today kind of, mapped to very key parts in my life. So it's kind of interesting to, have that and then have your own personal review. I think that's what I get inspired from that. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you for chiming in. Mm-hmm. Anybody else?
Hi, Daniel. It's Linda. Do you know when the new cycle of Saturn and Uranus will take place? I think it'll be 2038.
2032. I'm glad you brought that up, because there's something I also left out, which I think is an interesting thing. Thank you for that.
Oh, that's okay. Do you know the sign that it'll be in?
Yes, I do. Let me find my notes here. I have to think of it. At the next square in
Yeah.
2020, at the next square in 2021, the third quarter square of the cycle is going to parallel. I know you're Australian, but the U.S. Pluto return
Uh-huh.
and Neptune opposition, which I think is terribly interesting. The 28th, 2032 is the exact conjunction, and it will be at 28 degrees of Gemini.
Uh-huh. Opposite the galactic center. So it started, the last one began on the galactic center, and this next one is going to be opposite the galactic center.
Yeah, yes. There's, an interesting correlation. There's a lot of interesting math between these two planets. We have an 84-year cycle and a 28-year cycle. So we're working with multiples of 7. There are actually 3 cycles of Saturn within one cycle of Uranus. And it's a 90-year synodic cycle for the conjunction, for the two. Approximately every 90 years, they conjoin again once in a sign about 30 degrees past where they last conjoined.
Oh, that's so interesting. Thank you, Daniel. And any other questions or comments?
Thank you, Daniel. This was just really amazing.
Well, stay tuned, because we're only, about 2/3 of the way through this cycle, and it could get very interesting before it completes.
Yeah, thanks so much for presenting all those historical facts. It's so easy to see how these two are operating in the world. And so thanks for making that very evident.
You're welcome. Thank you for presenting all this to begin with.
That's okay, you're welcome. So thank you very much, Daniel. And I'll just unmute everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Again.
Excellent. So we'll see you next time, Daniel, and thanks everybody.
Thank you, Daniel.
Happy Candlemas, everybody.